As Catholics, we know by the gift of faith that there is only one church, the church established by Jesus Christ, which is the Catholic Church. Well, that may be true, but that one Catholic Church today seems to have two distinct religions. Stay tuned as we look at this phenomenon.
Boomer's Church, entertaining and enlightening stories, interviews, analysis, and everything else about life in the church before, during, and after the council. Boomer's Church with your host, Edward Schaefer, starts now.
To say that the church has two religions is no small matter. It purports a serious crisis of identity in the church. Just how serious is this crisis? Well, let me describe it this way. In 1955, during the decade prior to the council, about 75% of U.S. Catholics attended Sunday Mass regularly. Today, that number rests at about 25%. However, the raw number doesn't tell the whole story. A large percentage of those Catholics who attend Mass regularly today are elderly. As they die, if the current absence of younger people at Mass continues, this 25% attendance figure will continue to drop dramatically. Let's compare this figure to the Protestant Revolution, which is generally considered to be a catastrophic event in the life of the church. During this period, the church lost between 20 and 30% of her members. So the drop in Sunday Mass attendance in recent decades of 67%, that's the percentage from 75% to 25%, is more than twice the percentage of people the church lost during the Protestant Revolution. It may be more than triple. Now, it's tempting here to divert into a discussion about what has caused the decline. I'm going to resist that temptation, leaving that discussion for another time. Here, I'll simply outline the development of what I am calling two religions. One is the religion fostered by Vatican Council II and its reforms. The other is the religion of a resistance movement that wants to hold on to the theology and sacramental and pietistical practices of the church that were in place prior to the reforms of Vatican Council II. That is, there is the post-conciliar religion and the traditional religion. To demonstrate the differences between these two religions, I'd like to share with you two course descriptions of a college course called the Second Vatican Council. The first description is from a course taught at what we would call a small, conservative, orthodox Catholic college that is completely committed to the reforms of Vatican Council II, including changes in the theology, the Mass, that is the new Mass, the Novus Ordo Missae, the sacraments, and so on. So let's take a look. The Second Vatican Council. The authentic sense and context of the documents of Vatican II are explained. Widespread distortions of the Council's doctrines are exposed and refuted in a close analysis of key texts. This is a short description, but it tells us a lot. Let's unpack it. To say that the authentic sense and context of the documents of Vatican II are explained implies immediately that there must be a sense of these documents that's not so authentic. For example, if I wrote a book called The Authentic History of the Civil War, well, the very title would imply that there are histories of the Civil War that are not so authentic, and that my book would correct these inauthentic histories. This understanding of this course description is affirmed in the second sentence, which tells us that, quote, the widespread distortions of the Council's documents are exposed and refuted in a close analysis of key texts. Indeed, the course contends that there are interpretations of the Council documents that are incorrect, and this course will correct those misinterpretations. The course then is an apologetic for the Second Vatican Council. This is a course that embraces and defends the post-conciliar religion. Here's another course description from a course on the same topic, the Second Vatican Council, taught at a college that would be considered a small traditional institution. Vatican II, the crisis in Catholic life and thought. This course provides an in-depth examination of the Second Vatican Council, its historical antecedents, and its profound impacts on Catholic life and thought. Beginning with the modernist crisis of the late 19th century, students will explore the theological and philosophical underpinnings that set the stage for Vatican II. The course covers the pre-conciliar period, the history of the Council, its key documents, and the sweeping post-conciliar reforms initiated by subsequent popes. Special attention will be given to the various responses from groups within the traditional Catholic movement, analyzing their positions and their broader implications for the Church. Through a combination of lectures, primary source analysis, and critical discussions, students will gain an understanding of the crisis within the Church sparked by Vatican II and how to respond to it. Now, just to be clear, this is not a course taught at the Collegium. We do not have a course devoted specifically to Vatican Council II. We treat this council as we do all the councils of the Church in the context of studying various theological, philosophical, historical, and moral issues, and how these issues have been treated throughout the history of the Church by different councils. Yes, there really were other ecumenical councils than just Vatican II. In fact, there have been 20 other ecumenical councils. However, judging from this description, I would say that the course aligns with how the Collegium would treat this subject. So let's unpack the description. First, the very title tells us that this course views Vatican II as a crisis. It is not going to see Vatican II as a wonder of the Church, at least in the positive sense. This is quite the opposite of the first course. The first sentence of the course description is simply a statement of process. The course is going to examine the Council, its historical antecedents, and its impact on Catholic life and thought. Then the second sentence outlines the Council's antecedents. It says, beginning with the modernist crisis of the late 19th century, students will explore the theological and philosophical underpinnings that set the stage for Vatican II. Now, it's noteworthy that the course sees the crisis of modernism as an antecedent to the Council. It's not hard to deduce from this that the course will likely point to various aspects of the Council that are the result of modernist thinking. Again, this is quite the opposite of the first course, which most likely will defend the Council from such accusations. The next sentence describes, again, the process of the course. It will examine the pre-conciliar period, the history of the Council, its key documents, and the sweeping post-conciliar reforms initiated by subsequent popes. And the course will also study various responses to the Council, that is, responses of those who resist the conciliar reforms. The first course, while not using this language, also looks at these critiques of the Council. However, the first course is committed to refuting these critiques, while the second course is not so committed. Finally, this second course studies the Council as a spark that lights a crisis in the Church. Now, regardless of where you lie on the continuum, that on one end sees Vatican Council II as the greatest achievement of the Church, the moment when the Church finally got Catholicism right, and on the other end, that sees the council as a horrible mistake that has resulted in a crisis, a veritable collapse of the faith. These course descriptions give a view of two very different ways of looking at the council. Now, before I conclude, it's important to address one matter. That is, the idea that Vatican II was a great council, but we have simply not implemented it fully or properly, or whatever adverb you want to use to describe an implementation process that has been flawed or incomplete. There was nothing wrong with the council itself, just the implementation. Or 60 years is really not enough time to see the fruits of the council. It will take longer for them to fully blossom. Well, let's use another comparison to analyze these arguments. Vatican II concluded in the middle of the electronic age. In the 1960s, we had radio, TV, which allowed for widespread distribution of news, teaching, etc., much more quickly than in previous eras. And over these last 6 decades, the widespread use of computer technology and the internet has only made such distribution more rapid. The documents and the Reformed Mass and sacraments were able to be printed and distributed very quickly and widely after the Council. Now contrast this to the Council of Trent, which concluded in 1563. In 1563, the printing press had been invented, but printing was not yet the rapid process it was in the late 20th century. The documents of the Council of Trent were slow to be distributed, at least in comparison to those of Vatican II. There was no radio, no TV, no computer, no internet to facilitate rapid and widespread distribution of conciliar documents or conciliar teaching. Yet, in the 60 years that followed the Council of Trent, there was great progress in implementing the various reforms, or perhaps we might say clarifications, of the Council. Let me give you just a few examples. First, there was a significant spiritual and moral revitalization of the priesthood. Seminaries were established. A new clerical ideal of personal sanctity, pastoral zeal, and example was established, replacing one of social privilege. Many bishops, inspired by Trent's reforms, for example, St. Charles Borromeo in Milan, became models of pastoral care, living among their flock, reforming clergy, and promoting education and charity. So by the early 17th century, much of the clerical corruption, ignorance, and absenteeism that had fueled the Protestant revolt was significantly reduced. Compare this to the progress we've made in cleaning up clerical abuse and corruption since Vatican II. Second, Trent's clear teaching and standardized worship fostered a strong sense of unity. The Roman Missal of 1570 and the Breviary of 1568 created a uniform liturgy across the Catholic world. The same Mass was celebrated from Rome to Mexico to Manila. Now I realize you might say, well, wasn't that unity the whole reason the post-Vatican II popes have tried to eliminate the traditional Latin Mass? Well, no, the issues between the two times are very, very different, and I'll address those at another time. But the Catechism of the Council of Trent, 1566, provided clear, consistent doctrine for the clergy and the faithful alike. The current catechism does not provide the same kind of clarity, and it seems to be changeable at the whim of a pope. Doctrinal clarity, especially on justification, the Eucharist, and the sacraments, gave Catholics a confident sense of theological identity in contrast to Protestant teachings. So the Church emerged with a renewed sense of universality and cohesion, grounded in common worship and teaching. Third, the Tridentine spirit, I'll call it, energized both old and new religious orders. Reformed orders, like the Carmelites under St. Teresa of Avila and St. John of the Cross, rekindled contemplative prayer and mysticism. New orders, especially the Jesuits, the Oratorians, and the Ursulines spread education, preaching, and missionary zeal worldwide. Jesuit missionaries like St. Francis Xavier, Matteo Ricci, and Jose de Anchieta carried the gospel to Asia, Africa, and the Americas. Thus, in the decades after Trent, the Catholic Church experienced an age of global expansion, becoming a truly universal church with vibrant missionary frontiers. Fourth, with what I'll call Tridentine spirituality, it deepened and enriched lay and religious life. There was growth in Eucharistic devotion, Marian devotion, and popular confraternities. New devotional practices, such as 40 hours devotion, frequent confession, rosary confraternities, strengthened the laity's sense of belonging to the Church. Catechesis and preaching were improved, making the faith more accessible to common people. So lay people became more actively involved in spiritual life, with a richer devotional culture and deeper understanding of the faith. Fifth, there was a post-conciliar educational and cultural flourishing. Jesuit schools and universities became renowned centers of learning, combining rigorous academics with strong moral and spiritual formation. The arts flourished under the patronage of the Reformed Church. Baroque art and architecture, for example, the works of Bernini, Rubens, and others, expressed Catholic truth with emotional power and beauty. Composers like Palestrina embodied the ideals of sacred music promoted by the Council: clarity of text, reverence, and harmony. That is, Catholic education and culture entered a golden age, shaping European art, music, and intellectual life for centuries. Sixth, the Church expanded globally, evangelizing large parts of the world. The renewed missionary zeal led to a worldwide Catholic presence. New dioceses, seminaries, and universities were founded in the New World and in Asia. Indigenous clergy were trained and local cultures were engaged with respect, especially by the Jesuits. Catholicism became firmly rooted in Latin America and parts of Africa and Asia. By 1620, that's about 60 years after the Council, the Church had become a truly global communion, spreading the gospel to millions of new believers. And finally, there was the generation of saints who embodied the Trent renewal. St. Charles Borromeo, the bishop and reformer, St. Teresa of Avila, St. John of the Cross, St. Ignatius of Loyola, St. Francis Xavier, St. Philip Neri, St. Francis of Sales, and Robert Bellarmine, among many others. There was a spiritual renaissance marked by mysticism, missionary zeal, and renewed holiness that radiated throughout Catholic Europe and beyond. As a result of all this, by the early 17th century, again, roughly 60 years after the Council, the Catholic Church had regained much of the moral credibility and vigor that it had lost before Trent, positioning it as a resilient and missionary church entering the modern era. Now, compare this to the results of Vatican II. The corruption, abuse issues in the clergy have not been adequately addressed, and indeed, may be most prevalent in the Vatican itself. Seminaries are closing. Religious orders are shrinking. Schools and parishes are closing. We do not have coherent, unified understanding of the faith. The arts in the Church have deteriorated. Mass attendance has collapsed. Now, my intention is not to do a point-by-point comparison of the Council of Trent reforms and the reforms of Vatican II. It's simply to say that the argument that claims that there has not been enough time to implement the reforms of Vatican II properly or to evaluate reforms that are in a nascent stage, it's just simply not defensible. I think it's more defensible to say that the reforms of Vatican II have been implemented perfectly as intended, and that too I will explore with you in another episode. To get back to the course descriptions, these two courses demonstrate two very different, even opposing views of Vatican II, and as a result, of the Catholic religion. One is the view that sees the post-conciliar religion, as one course describes it, as the authentic religion. The other is the view that the post-conciliar religion is a crisis in Catholic life and thought. These two religions could not be more apparent in the two rites of the Mass and the various sacramental rites. One religion sees the new Mass as a shared meal. The other religion sees the Mass as the renewal of the sacrifice of Christ on the cross at Calvary. Now, I've barely touched on the topic that deserves much more exploration and discernment, which I hope you will do, and with which I intend to help you. For now, I hope I've at least tweaked your consciousness enough to encourage you to explore this topic on your own. Your eyes won't be just opened, they will pop out of your head. Thank you for tuning in, and I will invite now my good friend and colleague, Johnny Cash, to give us some closing remarks. Johnny?
Give me that old-time religion. Give me that old-time religion. Give me that old-time religion, Lord, it's good enough for me.